Hi, thanks for watching Flashback Friday. Let's get started. Today's lesson is going to be about the Progressive Era, and I want you to look for future lessons on the early environmentalists and the social justice movements. They'll be coming out next. The Progressive Era was a period of about 30 years, and it followed the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution was a period of explosive economic growth. But with that economic growth came social and economic inequality. So, this period of time is referred to as the Gilded Age. Because when something is gilded, it appears to be gold, but it really isn't pure gold. It just looks nice and shiny and beautiful on the outside. But if you were to peel that layer back, it was not what it seemed. So, this political movement of progressivism was a response to try to solve society's problems that again were caused by the second industrial revolution. There were four constitutional amendments that came from this time, and they're reflective of what society was like during this period. The administrations of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson are during this progressive era. Now, they each had a different way to govern, but when it came to the problems of society, they all agreed that you could use your knowledge and apply technological advances to perhaps solve some of society's problems. Starting in the late 19th century, political machines dominated the day to day functions of most large US cities. Now, the political machines were run by well known, powerful bosses. That's what they were called. And these bosses oversaw neighborhood captains. And below the neighborhood captains, there were some other rank and file workers. Sometimes a boss was an elected official, but more often than not, this political boss held a non elected position, and they did all of their work behind the scenes. They did this because they wanted to keep a particular elected official in office. Machine bosses would deliver votes to these elected officials by coordinating the efforts of neighborhood captains. These elected officials would offer patronage, which patronage is when you give somebody a job or you do something for them, maybe you give them money, and the expectation is that that person will then support you or support your candidate. In New York City, a political machine boss named George Plunkett, who is pictured here, he directed his neighborhood captains to go to the scenes of apartment fires and offer money to the victims and give them lodging, essentially take care of them. And Plunkett in turn, Plunkett and his captains called on the victims at election time to cast their votes for a particular candidate. So they would say, "Hey, do you remember when we were there for you in in your time of need? Well, now it's time for you to help us." The main goal of a political machine was to keep the boss in power. These organizations often contributed to the success of immigrants in these large US cities. This was a period of heavy immigration to the United States. This is when immigrants were coming through Ellis Island, and they were coming from all different areas of mostly Europe. There was one particular machine that was known as Tammany Hall, and it was run by Boss Tweed. This political machine targeted immigrants, and they offered all kinds of free services. Usually, the immigrants were having difficulty finding a job. If they didn't have a job, they certainly didn't have any money. In some cases, they spent all of their money on the voyage to America. So they used this process of patronage, and they specifically helped Irish immigrants gain access to jobs. Irish immigrants faced a lot of discrimination, so Tammany Hall helped them with that. Pictured here is Boss Tweed, and this is also a picture of Tammany Hall, which actually still stands today. While political machines were problematic, they did accomplish some things. For example, if we use New York City and Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed as examples, you'll find that during Boss Tweed's reign of this political machine, the size of Manhattan increased. The city set aside a portion of land for culture, specifically the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Construction on the Brooklyn Bridge started during this time, and also construction of orphanages and almshouses. Now, almshouses essentially are shelters, so it's a homeless shelter, and it put a roof over the heads of immigrants and other people in need. At the orphanages and almshouses, there were also social services that were offered. One of the drawbacks of political machines, despite the good things they did, was that they were often associated with organized crime. That's why I pointed out that the organization of a political machine is very much like that of a crime family. They were targeted by progressives because they were simply undemocratic. Progressives wanted people to be able to participate more directly in democracy. They believed that there was a greater influence by everyday Americans, and that would improve society. That's what society needed. When political machines kept candidates in office simply by using patronage, those candidates did not necessarily care about doing what was best for their constituents. So this meant that they were not accountable. They didn't have to worry about getting elected again because it was almost guaranteed. So they didn't necessarily act in the best interests of the electorate. To combat these problems, there were some reforms, and the first is a referendum. Now, the referendum was an idea of actually a state representative from Oregon. His name was William Simon Uren, and he was a member of the Direct Legislation League. They proposed legislation that would establish the initiative and referendum process. And when the bill was passed, it allowed citizens to introduce and later on approve laws as well as amendments to state constitutions. Another contribution from the progressives was a recall by vote. If the electorate felt that their representative was not acting in their best interest, then they were able to recall them or take them back out of office by a vote, the same way they got into office. Another reform from progressives was direct election. The framers of the Constitution had outlined how members of Congress were to be chosen. Members in the House of Representatives would be elected by the people, popular vote, and they would become the winners would become representatives of their constituents in their districts. But the Senate was different. The senators were chosen by state legislatures. And the framers of the Constitution did this because it was a wonderful exercise in federalism. Federalism is when you have the state and national governments working together. So the fact that a state government could choose representatives for the federal government was a perfect example of what federalism was. The problem with this was that at this time, in the late 1800s, the Senate had become known as the Millionaires' Club. The people that were in the Senate were wealthy and they had performed political favors and they were chosen by their friends in state legislatures. They weren't necessarily, again, the best people for the job. The people that were choosing the senators, those state legislators, they were put into office by political machines. And so, this accountability that a candidate and representative should have was not there. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution required that senators now had to be directly elected by the people from their states. Another reform was the primary election system. In a primary election, voters of a party directly choose one candidate from the party to represent them in the general election. So, for example, this past spring in Pennsylvania, Democrats went to the polls during the primary to choose between Biden, Warren, and Sanders. And the winner of that primary was the person that Pennsylvania Democrats, the majority of them, wanted to go forward to the general election. The primary process was wanted because it was going to take the wind out of the sails of political machines. You see, prior to the primary system, it was the political machines that would choose the candidate. After the Progressive Era, this power was back in the hands of ordinary Americans. Another amendment that came from the Progressive Era was the 16th Amendment, which allowed the government to impose a tax on every citizen's income. This was the first time in United States history that there had been a federal income tax. Governments don't have money, people have money, and the government gets money by taxing the people. So the Revenue Act of 1913 is what allowed Congress to do this, what gave the amendment some momentum and power. The first income tax rates were imposed on single people making about $3,000. Now, that was 1913. In today's money, it would be about $66,000. Now, the rates were by no means high in comparison to today's standards. But this was the first time in America's history that the incomes of the very wealthy were taxed. And with that money that the government took from the wealthy, they were going to redistribute it to the poor. Another benefit of the federal income tax is that the government no longer had to rely on tariffs. Prior to income tax, that's where the government received their funds from. The Revenue Act of 1913 also established the tax code that allowed charities to be tax exempt. And sometimes today you hear organizations referred to as a 501c. This also is important during the Progressive Era because charitable acts were what the Progressive Era was all about. Another progressive amendment was the 18th Amendment, prohibition of alcohol. It banned the manufacturing, sale, and transportation of alcohol in the United States. Progressives had been concerned about alcohol consumption for some time, and there had been a temperance movement that began in the early 19th century, and it became a major force by the late 19th century. Members of the temperance movement promoted the ban as a benefit to the American family. The idea was that men were working in factories all day and they were going to bars and saloons after work to blow off some steam. It was believed that they were spending their hard earned dollars on booze rather than their families. And then, once under the influence of alcohol, they went home and often mistreated their wives and children. Another benefit to prohibition of alcohol was that it would disempower political bosses and political machines. Political machines often operated out of bars and saloons, so many progressives saw prohibition as accomplishing two major goals at once. The temperance movement was supported by some groups like Methodists and Baptists and opposed by others like Catholics. If you know anything about Catholic Mass, wine is one of the parts of the communion. Pictured here is Carrie Nation, and she was known for her black bonnet and that hatchet in one hand. In the other hand, she often carried a Bible. Nation actually used that hatchet to smash up bars and saloons. Why did she do this? Because she had been married to an alcoholic for a brief period of time. By 1917, two-thirds of the states had some form of prohibition, and three-quarters of the U.S. population lived in quote unquote dry areas. This is where alcohol could not be purchased legally. Federal laws like the Webb-Kenyon Act of 1913 forbade transport of liquor into dry states, and the Conscription Act banned the sale of liquor near military bases. They were strong indications of how the nation was going to react to prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. The Volstead Act was passed by Congress in that year to carry out the intent of the amendment. Remember, it banned the manufacturing, sale, and transport of alcohol, but it did not ban drinking alcohol. The final progressive amendment is the 19th Amendment, granting suffrage, which is the right to vote, to women, and it was one of the most important achievements of this era. The women's suffrage movement actually had its roots in the abolitionist movement and temperance movements in the 19th century. Two leaders from those movements, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they set the stage for this eventual passage of the 19th Amendment. Stanton was born in Massachusetts, and she was an abolitionist. She also organized a women's convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. And at this convention, they issued a declaration calling for equality of women. If you recall, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution never really addresses women, instead, just addresses men. Susan B. Anthony was an activist from New York. She was a Quaker, and she formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Now, this group opposed the extension of voting rights to African Americans, unless women were given the right to vote too. This was not the only group addressing suffrage for women. There was another group that they competed against called the American Women's Suffrage Association. And the American Women's Suffrage Association believed that voting rights should be immediately given to African Americans, even if the struggle had to continue for universal suffrage. So eventually, these two groups merge into one, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and this happens at the beginning of the Progressive Era in 1890. Stanton was the group's first president, and Susan B. Anthony happened to be the second. But it was going to be another leader who really doesn't get enough exposure, and she's going to be the one that sees the movement's plans realized. Her name is Alice Paul, and Alice Paul also, like Susan B. Anthony, was born to a wealthy Quaker family in New York. And she actually earned a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. She was by far one of the most educated women in the country. She had opportunities that not all women received. She studied abroad, and when she was in London, she learned the tactics of civil disobedience from an activist named Emmeline Pankhurst. When she came back to the United States in 1910, she became the head of the NAWSA's Congressional Committee, and she began fighting for a constitutional amendment that granted women the right to vote. On March 3rd, 1913, she led a suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., and she wanted to draw attention to suffrage and away from Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this is the beginning of when Alice Paul becomes a thorn in the side of Woodrow Wilson. A year later, Paul leaves the organization and she forms her own organization, the National Women's Party. She also organized a 7-month picket of the White House. And for this, she was jailed, she was placed in solitary confinement, and she was even force fed because she went on a hunger strike. That's how passionately she felt about women's suffrage. Despite how the authorities treated her, in 1918, President Wilson decided to support the women's right to vote. As a side note, the amendment process, as per the Constitution, requires the cooperation of both federal and state government. As a matter of fact, it's another example of federalism. For an amendment to be proposed, it needs to be passed by two-thirds of both houses of Congress, and then it goes to the states for ratification. Three-fourths of all states have to ratify the amendment, and so Tennessee, becoming the 36th state to ratify it, fulfilled that requirement. So, just as a review, there were four amendments that came out of the Progressive Era: the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax; the 17th Amendment was the direct election of senators; the 18th Amendment was the prohibition of alcohol, which, by the way, is the only amendment to ever have been repealed and done so by another amendment, the 21st Amendment. But the fourth Progressive Era amendment was the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote. You will be asked about these amendments on quizzes and tests, so please become familiar with them.